Okay, testing 1, 2. Hello everyone, my name is Edgar Lobaton. I'm a professor in the Electrical and Computer Engineering department, and I'm also leading the efforts on the Applied AI initiative at the College of Engineering level. And it's a pleasure for me to have here René Vidal. René is the Penn Integrates Knowledge and Rachleff University Professor of Electrical and Systems Engineering and Radiology, the Director of the Center for Innovation in Data Engineering and Sciences, IDEAS, and co-chair of Penn AI at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also an Amazon Scholar and affiliated chief scientist at NORS, and a former associate editor in the chief of TPAMI. His current research focuses on the foundations of deep learning and trustworthy AI and its applications in computer vision and biomedical data science. His lab has made seminal contributions to motion segmentation, action recognition, subspace clustering, matrix factorization, deep learning theory, interpretable AI, and biomedical image analysis. He is an ACM Fellow, AMBE Fellow, IEEE Fellow, IAPR Fellow, and a Sloan Fellow, and has received numerous awards for his work, including the IEEE Edward McCluskey Technical Achievement Award, the Lambert Faculty Award, J.K. Agarwal Prize, ONR Young Investigator Award, NSF Career Award, as well as the Best Paper Awards in Machine Learning, Computer Vision, Signal Processing, Controls, and Medical Robotics. Let's welcome René.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in this very cold day. It's my pleasure to be visiting, and thank you, Edgar, for a wonderful introduction. I think we're all excited about AI today. One of the great things about it is that it's beginning to work for many things, but it's beginning to work for things that actually matter to people. It's beginning to potentially be useful for medical diagnosis or deciding whether you get a credit or not. And when that happens, I think we need to worry about whether the decisions are correct. And it's not just getting a certain accuracy. We need to worry about robustness, fairness. And in many of these applications where the end user is not an engineer, but maybe a clinician or maybe my grandmother, the question of making sure that those decisions are interpretable to the end user in a way that they can trust what the algorithm is predicting has become just increasingly important. So in this talk, I plan to focus on two of these topics, and maybe I'll only have time for the first. We'll see how we go. The first part is really this question of interpretability. How do we make sure that these models make predictions that a layhuman can understand and begin to trust? And the second one is really focused much more on large language models and trying to understand this question of hallucinations. Do they respond correctly or not? But also, actually, maybe even more importantly, when interacting with a human, is the response maybe toxic? And therefore, how do we align responses of LLMs with human values? So let me begin with the first topic of interpretability. And I like to use medicine as one possible motivation, in particular radiology. So if you begin with something like an MRI scan of the brain, and you feed that MRI scan to a deep network, and that deep network says you've got Alzheimer's with 98% probability. If you do that today with the vast majority of systems, this is simply a black box. It takes an image as an input, it does a lot of computations in between, and makes a prediction. But why that prediction was made, it's really a black box. We don't really have a reason. And it would be much better, and perhaps the expectation of our radiologists trying to understand how algorithms work would be, well, you have 98% probability of having Alzheimer's because there is this region in the brain called the amygdala that is enlarged, right? Or there is this other region that presents atrophy. So how do we get AI systems to go from being black boxes to producing explanations and interpretations for what they are predicting? This has been an area of great interest over the last 10 years in AI. And by and large, the idea has been whether we can assign to, say, every pixel in an image a score that signals sort of the importance of that pixel for making the prediction. And there are many techniques for doing that. Here are a few names like Lime, GradCam, and SHAP. But by and large, these techniques are based on what I call sensitivity analysis. They simply try to say, hey, if the prediction is Alzheimer's, the importance of this pixel, well, if I change the label a little bit, what is the importance of changing? So this can be done, say, with computing derivatives. So that's why GradCam is one of those methods, based on gradients of the output prediction with respect to the input. But if you look at these so-produced heat maps, where red means it is important for the prediction, and blue means that it's not important for the prediction, what happens is that we humans begin debating, why did it pick that region? In fact, you would even say, why did it pick so many regions that are outside the skull? That actually doesn't make any sense. So while in the ideal world, we would like to do these so-called post hoc explanations. Post hoc means the model is already trained, it's working very well, it says that it's 99% accuracy. So I don't want to touch it because the model is supposed to be good. So I try to look after, why did it make the prediction it made? And so while that's very appealing, and perhaps we should work on getting better methods, the state of the art today, it's really not satisfactory at all because, as I just gave as an example, it produces regions that don't make sense. It means that people begin debating as to why you pick one region or another. Or sometimes the class might be A and the opposite of A, and the region being highlighted is about the same. So there is a lot of debate in the literature, and there's people that have gone on social media saying that most of these methods are nonsense and that we should be far more worried if we hear in the news that an explainable AI technique was deployed in a hospital than if we hear that it was not. So what do we do about it? So what we have been arguing is that if explainability is meant to be for the layman, we should begin by defining what we mean by explainability. In fact, every person you talk about might have an explainability for a different person. A scientist might want to understand explainability of an AI model based on, well, it gives me the equation F is equal to ma, so that's interpretable to me. Or an engineer might say, well, I look at the principal components and this is the most important, right? But to a lay human, more likely than not, explanations in terms of human language would make more sense. And in particular, we argue that these explanations need to depend on the user, need to depend on the task, need to depend on the domain. Hopefully, you would guess immediately that if I'm going to do an explanation about radiology versus an explanation about climate, I'm going to use a different vocabulary, different words. That makes sense that they depend on the task. But why should they depend on the user? Well, it matters who I'm explaining things to. If I am a clinician, I've made a diagnosis, and I want to explain that to another clinician, I know that that other person is an expert. I'll use certain words, certain vocabulary. If I want to explain the same diagnosis with the same data for the same patient to the patient, I'm more likely than not use a different explanation. Right? So how can we capture the user, the task, in defining what an explanation is? So we suggest that you can do that by defining what we call here a query set. A query set is simply a set of questions and answers in human language. And those queries can be adapted to the task. So if the task is, what is the class of this bird, you could begin to think that talking about the body parts attributes, like is the belly yellow, is the beak elongated, those might be sort of very natural questions that a human might ask. And in fact, an expert in classifying birds, which I'm not, they do so by simply paying attention to 10 attributes and they sort of figure out what the bird is. And those 10 attributes change depending on the bird, so they might even do this in an adaptive manner. On the far right, and we are all very familiar with this, the first time we go to a doctor for a checkup, they, do you have fever? How are you feeling? The diagnosis is based on a sequence of symptoms and a sequence of questions and answers that then, depending on that, they'll decide, do we do a test, do we not do a test, and what. So this has motivated some methods, and this is what I'm advocating for in this talk, that are explainable by design, where the first thing we do is to say, an explanation is going to be a composition of these queries and of these concepts. And how can I make an algorithm explainable by design? So this is a family of methods. They're called concept bottleneck models. And the idea is that you begin on the far left with an input image. You have some deep network that predicts all of the concepts that you have predefined. These are features about animals in this case. And then you have a linear network. This is a linear classifier that takes the concepts as an input and then makes a prediction of what the class is. In this case, is a bison. And so the approach is that you begin by defining what are the relevant attributes based on which the classification is going to be made. Does it have horns, fur, wings, four-legged, or not? Then you need to answer the queries. This is done by training the network that predicts the answers to all queries. Suppose that this was 1,000. So this is a 1,000-way classifier to predict attributes. And then once you're done, this linear classifier, so why did they use a linear classifier? Because they thought, and this is again the engineering mindset, that, well, the attribute with the highest weight is going to be the most important, and the one with the second highest weight is going to be the second most important. However, this is not great in my view. First of all, why should we use a linear classifier? The layman does not care whether we use a linear classifier or a nonlinear one. And so tying the explanations to the engineering weight, I think, is really non-essential, and it could make the quality of the operations actually worse, because we all know that a nonlinear classifier is going to do better than a linear one. Right? Second, it reduces the interpretability, because this linear classifier, there is going to be one such set of weights per class. So no matter what the input image is, it will produce the same explanation. So it's really producing an explanation for the class, not an explanation for this image in particular. And that's what I'm highlighting here at the bottom. So with that in mind, we proposed, and we began working on this 2017, but we had the first papers in year 2020 something. Just to tell you that when you're trying to do something hard, it takes a long time to figure out how to do it right. And the idea is actually incredibly simple. Is how many of you have played 20 questions in your life? Raise your hand. All right. So suppose that I'm going to play 20 questions with you. The simplest 20 questions game that I play with all of my little kids is, I have a number in my head from 1 to 10. Ask me a question. You have to guess the number. Actually, ask me a question. Who wants to ask me a question? Yes?
Is the number odd?
Is the number odd? Okay, good. Anyone else?
Is it greater than or less than 5?
Is it greater than or less than 5? Anyone else? All right. So let's go with your question. Is it odd? Suppose that I said yes. What's your next one?
I'd probably go with that one and try and figure out if I.
All right. So if I said yes, it's bigger than 5. What's your next question?
Is it greater than or less than 7?
Yes, exactly. So there is a way of defining the sequence of queries in a way that is kind of repeatable. It's sort of the same style. And as we just said, we're engineers. In fact, even my 10-year-old, when I played with him, he didn't quite say it in engineering terms, but he roughly said, I'm asking this because I'm kind of splitting the search space half and half every time. So the main point is exactly that. I give you the task, classifying words in images. And now you've got to come up with what is the first question that you're going to ask to determine the class of that word that is in that image. So in other words, unlike these deep networks that are black box, where the whole image is given to the system for processing, and then you predict the class. Here, you don't get to see the image. The classifier is supposed to make a prediction based only on this sequence of questions and answers. So at the very beginning, you have no clue, so maybe you have whatever your prior is, or a uniform distribution of all the birds classes. But it turns out that these sequence of questions here, 7 of them were enough for our AI algorithm to predict this is a green jay with 99% probability. Moreover, this is explainable by design, because if I predict this is a green jay, I can immediately tell you this is because we've got this sequence of questions and answers. And so the key idea is don't predict the 1,000 attributes all at once. It doesn't need to, maybe we're doing it too much on an extreme here, but just ask one question at a time. And it turns out that in most cases, you need very few questions and very few answers to make that prediction. Okay, this is at a high level, but to actually be able to do this for real, for many applications, the first point is how do I come up with the queries? Right. The second one is how do I answer the queries? And the last one is, how do I select what questions to ask and in what order, so that ideally I am being very efficient, but at the same time I'm being very accurate at making that prediction. And perhaps the third one is the most engineering part of it. In fact, since we are all electrical engineers, this is going to be information theory behind that. The first two are more computer scientists and very much based on big foundation models today. So let me tell you what we do to do that. First approach, particularly if you're working in science, well, just work with the experts. Ask them what are the questions they use in order to make predictions, and put those questions in your vocabulary of questions. For the case of birds, that was the case. The experts gave us 300 attributes for each one of those bird classes that we could use. This is very good also for explainability to the user, because the idea is that you can ask the user, in order for this device to be explainable to you, what questions do you ask in order for this to be explainable to you as a human? The downside, of course, is that this is not very scalable. If we wanted to implement this for many applications, right, we need to have some strategy to come up with the questions. So, but nonetheless, we were able to do that for the bird classification case, and also for the diagnosis. There is a diagnostic data set that comes with on the order of 300 symptoms that you have. Okay? But this requires you to annotate, because this requires you to have data for which you know the questions to begin. So what we did as an alternative was to leverage large language models, because now you can input, here is the 200 bird classes. Can you tell me what are important visual attributes for these 200 birds? And those might naturally end up being the color, the size, the shape, and based on those, can I use LLM type techniques to automatically produce these queries? Okay? So that is the second alternative, and that's what we have done in many of these cases. So all of a sudden, you can generate actually a very large number of questions, and in fact, it might be more than what's needed later. Okay, so suppose now that either the expert gave you the questions or you were able to use LLMs to get your queries. What do you do next? We need to answer the questions. So approach number one, which is what was doable when you have full annotations, is the same as in concept boundaries. You train a deep network that, given the data, predicts, is trained to predict whether a concept is present or not. But again, not very scalable, because this means I need to annotate everything. More importantly, and particularly, a user might have new questions you didn't think about. And so you really should figure out a way to have a system that is able to answer these queries. New queries. Okay, so how do we do for new queries? Well, when we began doing this, we didn't have foundation models, we didn't have LLMs, so we had to do the first one. But now, you can say, pick your latest and greatest ChatGPT 5 or 6, whatever it comes. Just feed an image, ask a question. We can use the API if you need to do it. I think this is probably the way we're going to be heading, and this is the way it's going to work. But this is costly. It takes, the time it takes per image and per question, when you're going to be trying to design this explainable system that requires training, right? At training time, I'll need to be calling an LLM with millions of images and millions of queries, and multiple times at every iteration of training. So this is way too costly, particularly for us in academia that don't have the resources to do all of that. So we were looking for alternatives to answer questions that were cheap and efficient. So the other extreme is to use methods like CLIP. For those of you who might not be familiar with CLIP, you take an image and it produces some embedding of it. Think of it as a vector associated with that image. You take text, like a query, and you produce a text embedding of that question. So now that's a vector. Those two vectors are of the same dimension. CLIP is trained so that if the query and the image correspond to each other, if let's say if this is the caption for the image, then the dot product between these vectors is very high. And if the caption and the image are very different, then the dot product is near zero. So what we said was, aha, we can probably use this for answering questions, because if the dot product is high, the answer is going to be yes. If the dot product is low, the answer is going to be no. Okay? And now this is going to be fast and cheap. This model is already pre-trained. All I'm doing is just take a dot product. I can do this very easily. So for this to work, I would have liked the distribution of the clip dot products to look like this, right? The x-axis is the dot product between 0 and 1, and it's either 0 or 1, and I can easily determine whether the answer was yes or no. However, if you take images and you take queries and you feed them to clip, the dot product looks like this. It's like a Gaussian center at 0.5. So clip as is completely unusable because you can't tell if the answer is yes or no. It's 0.5 most of the time. So the question was, how do we modify clip, right? We are willing to afford a little bit more cost, but not too much, so that we can get the answers very quickly. That was the conundrum. So here's just pure creativity and basic understanding. What my students did was simply to actually realize the following. For most queries, they are known to be false based on the class alone. And so here's one example. If the question is, does the dog have fins? I don't need to look at any image to know that the answer is no, dogs don't have fins. Okay. On the other hand, if the question is, does the dog have a leash? Right, that's a relevant question. That's an image relevant question. And so in that case, I need to look at the image. So what this means is that we can leverage GPT in a more efficient way, not to answer all the questions in real time, all the time, multiple times, as in the previous case, but rather offline, before we get started, we can just create pseudo-labels using a combination of GPT and clip. Specifically how? We take GPT here, we give the query, and we give the class, in this case, dog and the question. And GPT, in this particular case, says no. So I just believe GPT. I said, okay, the answer is false. If, on the other hand, GPT says yes, then I don't fully trust GPT, and then I look at clip, and then I compute the clip dot products. Right? So via this combination of GPT and clip, I can produce now pseudo answers to the queries. Once I have them, I can actually use them as a training set to train a very simple visual question answering system where the input to this network, which by the way is not a foundation model, it's not a transformer, it's actually something like a 3-layer MLP, so not 3-layer neural network, so not very complicated at all. That receives the image as an input and receives the question and produces the probability that the answer is yes or no. And we use these data generated like this to train that system. And once we have it, it works relatively well. So see, most answers are no in any case, but now you do see this bump here that allows you to put a threshold on the clip responses. So way better than that, where the answer was 0.5 all the time. Okay. Actually, you might even be curious, how well does this actually work at answering questions about images in a data set, and how does it compare to the vanilla version of only using clip, or how does it compare to using a fancy question answering system? And so here you've got, for example, for ImageNet, this is a database of 1,000 different object categories. The accuracy of just using dot products doesn't matter what the variants are, but it's about 50%, 50, 55. That's the accuracy in answering questions, so not very much. If now you use a much bigger and costly model, then yes, you do much better. Let's say you take the biggest one, you get 0.86 accuracy there. So with our method that is just super very light, we get about the same accuracy. I mean, we're not always the best, but could be the second best, but we are reasonable. And reasonable with much faster. So this is 1.5 seconds per query. This is 0.04 seconds per bird. Okay. So long story short, by leveraging existing foundation models, not directly to answer what you want, because that's too costly, but to produce pseudo labels, you can actually then train very simple systems that do well enough for the task of answering questions. Okay, so we now have a query set, and we now have a mechanism to answer questions about images. The third part is, how do I select what questions to ask and in what order to produce an explanation? So here's the algorithm. Let's go back to 20 questions, right? I ask one question. Is it bigger than 5? I said yes, and then you ask me, is it bigger than 7? And every time you adapt the question. So what is that mathematically? This is what's written here. So Q here denotes the question. Capital Q is the entire query set. Q of X, that's X could be the image. Q of X is the answer for that image. Y is the label that I'm trying to predict. So imagine again images, questions about images, and this could be the bird class. So what this equation says is select the question such that the mutual information I between the answer to the question and the label you're trying to predict is maximized. This is really select the most important question, the one that if you get an answer is going to reduce your uncertainty the most because of the relationship between mutual information and entropy. Okay. Once I have only one question I can begin predicting right away, and instead of using linear classifiers, you can just use the Bayes classifier. You can just predict the class, conditioned on the fact that I've answered one question. Okay. Next step, how do you do for the second question? The criterion is actually the same. Select the question whose answer is most informative for Y, but now conditioned on the history of questions and answers so far. Okay. And so on and so forth. And eventually you stop. When do you stop? You stop when all remaining questions are uninformed. Like, you know, in the guessing the number from 1 to 10, eventually you're going to get to a singleton, right? So you know, if I say yes every time, it is bigger than 5, it's bigger than 7, it's bigger than 9, then you know it's 10. So in 4 steps, logarithm of 10, typically, you will stop. Okay. So that's what I did here. Now, in practice, with images, this is maybe not going to be the case, but you could say, hey, if the highest hypothesis has a probability bigger than 0.9, whatever your favorite threshold is, then I'll stop. Okay. So that's the idea here. Okay, we learned this 20-something years ago. This was the famous information gain algorithm. The principles behind it, 1950, Shannon, mutual information. What's different? Difference number one, in Shannon, you could code and map input signals to any arbitrary binary code. Here, we're restricting the binary code to be semantic because each mapping from the signal to 0, 1 is based on these queries. Okay. So we call these algorithms semantic information pursuit because it's really doing coding and decoding using a semantic vocabulary, and is also doing this coding for a particular task Y, unlike Shannon that was doing this for reconstruction of X. The other fundamental issue, though, is that Shannon told us everything about information theory, but forgot about the question of compute. If X is an image, and so there's millions of variables, computing mutual information is actually incredibly challenging. Moreover, you actually need to have a generative model. Like if you're going to compute this, you need to have access to the joint distribution of Q of X and Y and all of that. Right? And so up until 2016, we did not have generative models for images that really work in practice with which we could compute. It's only after first GANs and then VAEs and now diffusion models that now, oh, I can take images, train a system, and I can actually learn this joint distribution with X and Y. And once I have it, I can begin to, at least I have a model to begin computing. But because these models are not analytical, they're not a Gaussian or a mixture of Gaussians or anything like that, most likely I need to do something to compute mutual information, because this mutual information is an average, is an expectations. So now maybe I need many sampling and super fancy sampling techniques, even just to implement every step of the way of this algorithm. So we did do all of that in that first paper, but we could only handle relatively simple image data sets that are considered completely old-fashioned today, like MNIST. And we could do so like 1,000 times lower than a simple neural network for classifying the MNIST. So this is all nice and elegant, but it's not practical with large data. So you really need to think carefully about how do you implement, say, information gain. So we've done many techniques, and I don't have the time to explain them in detail, but the first one was what I just said: learn that deep generative model and use the method by the book, but with fancy high-dimensional implementations together. I'll describe the second in a moment, which you're going to appreciate is way faster, better, and bypasses all of the challenges that I talked about. But if you're also familiar with the era of signal processing that was based on sparse coding, you will appreciate that, oh, this idea of asking one question at a time, getting an answer and updating is pretty much like the orthogonal matching pursuit algorithm that is trying to find a sparse representation of a signal in terms of a dictionary. That's kind of the principle of what we're doing. It's a representation of complex image data in terms of a real dictionary that is fully semantic of questions and answers about that. So we have papers connecting everything I'm talking about to sparse coding as well. So what is it that we did that actually works in practice and is scalable, and you don't lose anything, which was the biggest for us? Like, there is even a theorem of the correctness. What we said was the following: do you really need the most informative query? Well, probably yes. It would be nice. It's going to be faster. But do you really need to know that the mutual information is 3.567 with 20 digits of precision? Well, no, I just need the most informative. And then the second most important. But actually, the value of mutual information is irrelevant. So do I need to spend fancy sampling in million dimensions to get this number to a certain accuracy? Oh, no, no. So instead, why don't you just have a network that you give it the sequence of questions and answers so far and predict what question to ask next? It's a classification problem, right? If I have 300 possible questions, it's simply selecting which one is next. Then that network will tell me what to ask. I'll have my answering mechanism that I already explained. I will produce the answer, and I have my list of questions and answers. Now I need a classifier that takes the sequence of questions and answers and predicts what the label is. And now I can train jointly this classifier and that query together to do better classification. In other words, is train a network to come up with good questions so that they improve classification downstream. And now train the querier and the classifier together. That's just the objective, the training objective, but long story short is that if you were to solve this problem to optimality, if you find the optimal query, it turns out it gives you the same thing as information gain. It gives you the most informative queries without having to ever compute mutual information. And a system like this, once you have a bunch of networks, inference is now you just feed data and it does it. So to summarize, we have developed an explainable by design system that is based on asking a sequence of questions, producing answers, and then making predictions based on that. And the key to everything is this information pursuit algorithm that is able to select the smallest possible number of questions to make that prediction. Let me now show you a couple of examples of how we've used these for many applications. So example number one is simply image classification. The x-axis in all of these plots is how many questions do I ask. The y-axis is the classification accuracy. The blue is black box model. Thank you, state-of-the-art classifier. The red is this information pursuit algorithm. At the beginning, it's doing badly. But look, with no more than 10 questions, it's already within 5% or less, maybe 2%. And from then on, you actually don't need so many queries. Just, I mean, the game is called 20 questions for a reason, right? Typically, with less than 20 questions, you can solve most tasks actually. Obviously, there's going to be a gap. Why is there a gap? Because the black box algorithm is allowed to use any possible feature, explainable or not, to do that prediction. While here we are constrained, hey, classify only based on these 300 possible questions that you might be allowed to ask. That being said, the gap is not that big. Here is for a much larger data set with 1,000 classes, and the gap here is still less than 10%, like 5 to 10%. Okay, so that's one example. Now a qualitative example. Again, this is the same ImageNet data set, 1,000 categories. What I'm going to be plotting here is the following. The x-axis now contains different classes. There are 1,000 of them, but I'm only putting 10 here. Then every row of this plot is what is the prediction of the class given the sequence of questions and answers so far. So at the very beginning, the probability of every class is 1 over 1,000. But I have no idea what the class is. So it's a game with 1,000 possibilities. And so everything is relatively blue. But you can see already that after 6 questions, there's only 3 main dominant options: zebra, bison, and probably water buffalo. Then after 10 questions, already bison is the most dominant. And in this case, with 12 questions, it got it that it's bison. Okay. Moreover, you can see sort of the reasoning of the algorithm as it goes through, right? Which is what you would expect. All what's happening is that I'm entertaining 1,000 hypotheses. I ask a question and I split the space. And little by little, only the most relevant hypotheses survive. But even if I stop in the middle, I can tell you it's a bison, and this is the probability, and this is the probability of all the other classes. And I can tell you the explanation thus far. Okay. Here is now the example for medical diagnosis. So this is a data set called SIMCAT. There is over 1 million doctor-patient dialogues. There is on the order of 300 symptoms and 200 diseases. And you can see again is the same plot. So the x-axis is the diseases. The y-axis corresponds to the sequence of questions and answers. Green is if the answer is yes. Red is if the answer is no. After just very few questions, it's either laryngitis or seasonal allergies. Notice that unlike the previous case, the algorithms can make mistakes and you can be misled and go into the wrong direction for some time. So here it was predicting that it was seasonal allergies for a good amount of time. It was only with the last question of do you have a hoarse voice that when the answer was yes, then it switched to laryngitis. We've now scaled these to radiology. So here the idea is, can we take radiology reports and make a prediction about one out of many possible diseases? And then for each disease, produce an explanation of what pieces of the report, what facts in the report were the relevant to making that diagnosis. So to do that, I thought we were done with these with images. Text is going to be easier. I said this is going to be a simple application. The students are going to get it done. 2 years after was the first paper we produced. Why? Defining what question to ask was already a challenge. After some times, we converged into, well, we have 500,000 reports. Let's just use LLMs to convert sentences into possible questions, some sort of clustering and linear redundancy, come up with the facts. That was exactly what we did here. So we took 500,000 reports and we used a lot of NLP techniques, and we published a paper in ACL in extracting medical knowledge and converting it into a query set. Second, you need to answer now, given a fact, is it present in this report, yes or no? What I did not anticipate, and this is now domain problems, right? Domain expertise, is if I come up with a data set of even 1,000 queries for radiology, in a particular report, for most of those, the answer is, I don't know. The information is not in the report. Okay. And so now this idea of expanding the information pursuit framework to handle not only yes and no answers, but also I don't know. And sometimes I don't know is not that I don't know. It was not written because, well, the clinician in charge had some background history and was asking about that report for a particular reason. And so this was not relevant to the case, and that's the reason it was not annotated. Right? So there is a lot of very partial information in these reports, and handling this uncertainty, I think, is a new version of information pursuit that we are working right now that we don't have. The rest was really we needed to adapt this information pursuit framework, the querier and the classifier that I talked about earlier, to being language. And so the answer was no longer an image classifier, but actually now it's an LLM in the loop. We are working right now in open-ended queries where you actually need to generate the answer, which is different from selecting one out of a finite set. So all of these are making problems at the intersection of language actually harder than I anticipated. But anyhow, we were able to do it, and we've now even extended these to not only just classification, like everything I said so far was classification. What if you wanted to do explainable image generation? What if, if I said to you, I have an image in my mind, and I want to play 20 questions with you, right? Every time I give you an answer, you begin having a mental picture of what that might look like. And little by little, that mental picture is converging to the actual content in my image. So we did that, but that required, there's still a querier and an answer, but now we have a diffusion model that produces and generates an image integrated. But the idea is, again, given a sequence of questions and answers, can you generate an image whose content is consistent with those questions and answers? And state-of-the-art diffusion models are good at generating images when you give them one prompt, but if you give them some 20 conditions, that conditional image generation is much harder to do and does not work very well. And these are examples from a recent paper last year where, we are saying it should not have curtains, it should have drywall, blah, blah, blah. You can see the instructions that are being generated little by little. Every red box is a mistake of a state-of-the-art, stable diffusion small, stable diffusion large, DALE. They all make mistakes. With our information pursuit framework that selects one question at a time and guides the diffusion model accordingly, we are able to produce generations that are fully consistent with the instruction. All right, so to summarize, I've advocated that rather than trying to explain the unexplainable, we should instead design models that are explainable by design. And I've advocated that we should develop techniques that leverage semantics, and ideally the explanations are in human text. And I've advocated that one possible approach that is well connected to information theory is this idea of selecting one concept at a time and using those sequence of concepts to make predictions. I was going to tell you about how we do trustworthy LLMs, but I think I have only 5 minutes, and probably you want to ask questions. So I would only say what this is about without explaining how we did it. But the main point here is simply LLMs may be very toxic when they respond. And the question is, how do we modify LLMs so that they respond in a way that is more aligned with human values? Then, by and large, I was going to tell you that the main techniques to doing so are either I do fine-tuning, which for every toxicity test requires a new fine-tuning, and so that's very costly, only the companies can do it. Or you as a user, you type your prompt and you tell, hey, LLM, behave nice, be a very nice person. But they may comply or they may not comply. So the question is, how do we make them comply without fine-tuning and without modifying prompts just under the hood? And the solution to everything is sparse coding, actually. What we do is look at the latent activity. These are big models. Think of whatever layer your favorite layer is. There's going to be some activations of that LLM. Those activations, which we denote here as Z, are decomposed as a linear combination of a predefined dictionary of concepts. Some of those concepts may be toxic, some of those may not be. So the role of sparse coding is to select those that are toxic versus those that are not, and then zero out at inference time the components that are toxic, and then pass them to the next layer. And when you do that, effectively little by little doing sparse coding at every layer of LLM. In fact, we don't even need to do them at all. We usually just do it at once. You eliminate the toxicity. Here's one example. You jailbreak the LLM and you tell, how do I manipulate people? Then they will say, use emotional appeals, leverage social proof, create echo chambers, blah, blah, blah. Our technique called parsimonious concept engineering produces very aligned responses that are not toxic. Obviously, there is a ton of examples in the paper. If you care about numbers, the main point of this is these are 9 different alignment tasks. PG, for example, is pornography. These are different methods. PACE, who is at the bottom, this is the safety score. And the safety score here is on the 90s, 93 to 98 for all tasks. While if you do nothing, your safety score is like 68%. If you do some of the existing techniques, you can get to 50s, 70s. But this is way better than the state of the art. Okay, I'll stop there and simply say thank you.
Thank you very much, René. So let's see if anybody has any questions. Ooh, okay, I have 3 and 1 over there. Let's start with those. Start from here.
Thank you for the interesting talk. So I was wondering the idea that you presented about maximizing information gain. This seems to show up in sequential sensor selection problems as well, where people have realized that if you can exploit some kind of submodularity of the objective function, you can make greedy algorithms work. So I was wondering if you have encountered something similar in the settings that you have considered. The other question that I had is, can you sort of relate the minimum number of questions that you need to get a desired accuracy to some kind of entropy of the image source?
Yes. All right, so fantastic question. So number one, when we actually wrote the proposal on semantic information pursuit, we had very ambitious goals, and indeed, we said, this is not just for explaining images, this is going to be for selecting what sensor is the most informative for this task. And we even thought of active sensing in the sense of, well, in order to classify whatever, someone who is behind, I probably need to move the camera in order to be able to do this evaluation. So all of those fall within the framework, and it's perfectly fine. As I said earlier, I think at the end of the day, I've realized that for each implementation, you need to learn the generative models to be able to do it, and that always requires work, and requires what is the query set and whatnot. So long story short, it is doable, but then there is always a year or two to actually implement it for whatever application you want. Greedy algorithms, yes, there are many submodular algorithms to doing so. It depends on the case. In the same way that we made that connection with sparse coding in particular, and L1 might be intractable, and OMP is a tractable greedy solution. This idea of asking one question at a time is already a greedy strategy for the real problem, which I didn't have a slide I usually have a slide. And that slide answers your last question. The formal definition of everything we did is minimize the expected code length subject to the sequence of questions and answers you select being a sufficient statistic for prediction. That is the optimization problem. It connects one-to-one correspondence with classical, the main difference being the query set is now restricted to being semantic. And so in order to get classical entropy, you need to simply say the set of queries is any binary query. And all of these bounds, we have now bounds on, we call this semantic entropy, by the way, to make the analogy, and semantic expected code length. We have bounds that connect this semantic entropy to the code length, lower bound plus 1 for the upper bound. All of those generalize as well.
Thank you.
So for a layperson like me, does it help to think at a very high level that query selection is kind of like selecting explainable features efficiently, and then the classification is kind of like forming a very efficient adaptive decision tree?
Yes. It's exactly that. It's exactly that. But the connection is a little bit deeper because you could have gone deeper and say, hey, why don't you just train a decision tree instead of doing all of this? The issue with training decision trees directly is that at training time, if I tell you what portion or fraction of the data satisfies this condition and that, after 2 or 3 conditions, you have no more training samples. So if instead you train your generative model for everything first, and then you can compute this information gain on the fly, you can build a decision tree of infinite depth in theory. And you don't run out of training examples at training. So this leads, therefore, to much better decision trees.
Yeah, so again about the IP, the information pursuit algorithm that you described, the maximization problem. So my question is that how is the solution or the algorithm or the conversion speed of the algorithm itself is dependent on the initial condition, which in this case probably means the first question that you ask.
Yes.
And is it possible to choose the initial condition or the first question using simple techniques such as metropolis testings or something like that?
So it turns out that the initial condition, the first question you ask, is fully dependent on the data distribution. Let's go back to the example that we all played with. I said the task is to guess a number between 1 and 10. Ask me a question. There was no search or anything. Immediately said, is it bigger than 5? Because you know that based on the distribution, if the numbers are uniform, you know that that's the optimal query that split the space half and half. So here, by analogy, under the assumption that I've learned a good generative model for P of x, y, this is selecting the most informative query that ideally reduces the uncertainty the most about predicting y. So theoretically, there is nothing better to do.
Let me also ask a very quick question. When you were presenting, these the adaptive and the sequential and the adaptive approach that you mentioned, right? So I couldn't help but constantly draw parallels with the rich tools that we have from classical control theory, for example. And if it's possible, I understand that the query set over here is semantic, as you said, so it's not very directly comparable. But let's say, for example, if I view the optimization, the recursion algorithm as a discrete time nonlinear system, then we have rich tools from region of attraction and things like that, which can help you in determining where the final answer is going to finally converge to, or how fast it's going to approach to. So I'm just wondering that is there any connection between that, if you can take help of some of these classical control tools to further benefit you in developing these algorithms, or is it a completely crazy idea?
So I've not thought deeply enough to answer the question properly, so I'm going to answer sort of in real time. I think that in order to leverage control techniques you probably need to have some dynamical system that underlines these sequences of questions and answers. And a priori, we don't have an explicit model really that relates one question to the next in an explicit manner. That is not to say that I suspect that you're right that is possible, but I would say that classical control techniques more likely be limited, and the reason I say is the following. The idea that I'm going to select a next question based on a very long history of previous questions and answers is much more akin to the modern transformer type techniques that have a very long context. While dynamical systems typically have a dimension of the state that gives you, that's the length of the memory that I'm gonna look at. So you might be right that if it is a decision-making task that is more Markovian, if you wish, perhaps one can, and the model, the Markovian model is more predictable, which I don't know if it is in general, then maybe using control techniques would be useful. But again, excellent question, we probably need to brainstorm more. I had never thought about that before.
There's one question.
Hi, great talk and very logical approach. The issue that I have with conditional image generation and text generation is that as you push the conditions, the output itself is usually losing the quality that you would expect. And usually the conditional image generation doesn't quantify this, as it doesn't align with the output that they expect or they wish to showcase. Is there any way that you tackle this?
Yes. So I only have one slide instead of a whole talk about the image generation part, but in the full talk, there is a way of assessing whether the generated image produced the content that you specified. The simplest way to do that is, because you already know the conditions, right? You can even have a visual question answering system and give a score for whether the generated images satisfy the conditions. If the questions are more about objects, you can run object detectors and do that. So yes, the evaluation metrics do consider that and take that into account. And that is precisely why I said that conditional diffusion models, for example, where as you put more and more conditions, very quickly begin to fail. And you can see those in those metrics.
Great. Maybe one more question. Last questions. Maybe two questions. Three, they're quick.
Sorry, my question is that wouldn't it be better to make the answer of queries fuzzy instead of being binary? For example, let's say an image is blurry and the answer to the one question is not only yes or no, it's maybe with the fuzzy logic, 60% yes and 40% no.
Yes. Number one, and I'm not going to go back to the table, but in the table there was clip binary and clip continuous. So we already did that evaluation. There are two parts. There is a little bit of you lose some explainability by going fuzzy when the true answer is yes or no. On the other hand, the flip side is there are tasks for which the answers are fuzzy, or in fact they're multi-class, like with the color. So from a theoretical point of view, the framework and the high level, I only explain it based on binary because that's simpler and because the implementation is easier. But the framework actually can be implemented. There's nothing in the mathematics that restricts these two binary questions in particular. It's only when it gets to the implementation that matters. Even at the more extreme, you could even push it forward to say, can I have continuous questions? Meaning, I think someone else alluded to that, like any point in clip space can be a question. So the answer is yes, but again, it becomes an implementation question. Instead of evaluating mutual information for 5 choices and picking the best, now you need to run an optimization problem. And so it's really you change the implementation aspects and the techniques that go behind, but the high level philosophy does not change and accommodate the question.
So one of the biggest weaknesses of AI image recognition models so far is extrapolating data from tables and infographics and graphical representations of data, such as audio waveforms and audio wavetables. How does IP better serve to extrapolate data from these data representation systems?
Again, I've never thought about that, so answering in real time. I conjecture that a priori this is independent from IP in that there isn't, it's really a question of data. AI works best when you have a lot of data and a lot of annotations. For the extraction of information of tables and connecting that to language and audio, the problem is that we don't have very large aligned data sets that are multimodal. And so one way of solving this will be we're going to eventually have massive multimodal data sets so that this will not be a problem. Another one is to really figure out strategies for the alignment of at least pairs of modalities. In my own work, not related to your specific question of tables and audio, I'm facing that with human motion, for example. There is far less data about human motion, or even think about how we humans describe how humans move in text. So the alignment between text and human movement is very limited, and you're going to have very poor answers because we humans don't even write much. Unless you are maybe a ballet instructor, you don't annotate that. So how can IP potentially help, which was your question? I suspect that it won't as is. It would if it could tell you explanations as to why something failed. But if the explanation is, if the real reason is you didn't have enough data, then IP will also fail because IP will also not have enough data to be tracked. So that's why I'm not so sure that it can be done so far without really improving the alignment part first.
Thank you.
There was one last question.
In the second half of your talk, you talk about how your algorithms align with safety standards. I'm wondering how researchers in your community include the perspectives of marginalized groups and the general public in defining those alignment standards.
So I don't work in that area. I point out to two great colleagues I have at Penn, Aaron Roth and Mike Kearns. Their specialty is their questions of fairness. And so there is a lot of techniques, I think, from the differential privacy and fairness literature that apply to translating human values into statistical properties that then can be used to constrain algorithms. My sense is that all of that literature has been well done for maybe tabular data where the variables have clear meaning. But translating that into language LLMs is still a research challenge that is actually currently heavily being investigated on how to do that. Where it would come into my research, if I had done it properly, actually maybe I should tell you what we did. We simply had a corpus of 40,000 concepts. We would say the task is toxicity, and we would call an LLM to tell us of these 4,000 concepts, split into two groups, toxic versus non-toxic. So in that, there wasn't any human input. There was nothing about your question. But there could be ways of doing it, and it could be incorporated at that level that we haven't done that yet.
Thank you.
Okay, let's thank our speaker one more time. Thank you very much. Great, and that concludes our session. Thank you very much everyone for coming.